The sanctuary, called the sanctuary, this whole area here is called the sanctuary. Of course, it means a place of safekeeping, a place of safekeeping, two meanings of the word, a place of safekeeping and a place of refuge. It literally was a place of refuge for those in the Middle Ages. For those who were fleeing persecution, you could take refuge in a church. And you had the law of sanctuary, actually, where you could go to a church, sit on a specially designated chair and cry sanctuary. Very important, actually, when you're under siege, or when you've got barbarians chasing you. And the law of sanctuary was almost inviolable until this century. Now, of course, there were, as you well know from the liturgical calendar, popes. In fact, yesterday was one of his feast days. It was a feast day of one such pope, Saint Callistus I, who was pope around until he died in 222 or thereabouts. Was martyred while saying mass. We have a whole litany of popes, can you believe, who were murdered while they were celebrating mass by Roman soldiers at the direction of the emperor. But you know, as time wore on, as Christianity established itself, following Emperor Constantine and so forth, and the fall of the Roman Empire, the church was a sanctuary. It was a home where you could take refuge. We call the refuges now. It was that, the barbarians would stop at the door. They wouldn't cross the threshold. They wouldn't cross the liminal space that we discussed at the beginning. But nowadays, with this, as you can see, with the countless desecrations in the Middle East, the murder of Archbishop Romero, and the recent death of Father Hamel, the law of sanctuary no longer applies, alas. But nonetheless, it does give you that sense that this was a place of a home that would protect you. Yeah? It would protect you. The second sense of that word sanctuary, a place of safekeeping. Now, because it's within the sanctuary, of course, that the host resides. The person that we came here, that's bringing us home, who has brought us from the outer space to the inner space, all the way up, purifying us, welcoming us, giving us. We've moved now from the settees, as it were, after our pre-dinner drink, right to the table, where the host will, as I said to you in the description of our lamb earlier on, will make us one with him by eating together. And not only eating together, but consuming him. And in consuming him, communing directly with one another and with our sacred source. This was also called, and it's wonderful that we have the old high altar here, because so few churches have them these days, at least in its intact way. You see the 3 steps at the foot of the altar there. Now, the side altar only had 1 step, because these were for private masses. As masses became more popular, private masses that is, in the early part of the Christian history, side altars were needed for priests to say the private masses. They wouldn't say them except in a church. So you needed side altars for that purpose. And the tradition kept going. Of course, public masses were eventually said at the side altars for smaller congregations, but nonetheless, that's what they were there originally for. But the symbolism of the 3 steps is very important, because they stood at the base of the altar. When they came in, they stood at the base of the altar. And there was this lovely little ritual when the priest and the server, I'll be back momentarily, stood at the base of the 3 steps. And they spoke to each other in Latin, a little ritual. Again, more cleansing. Remember, they were now going to the table of the host, and at the table they would become one with the host. But of course, you don't presume to sit when you're not told to sit. You don't march over to the host table and sit anywhere. You're told where to sit. And it would be the height of rudeness to just march up and make yourself at home. So the priest stood after the Aspergers May, when the congregation were sprinkled with the purificatory waters for the second time, and a reminder of baptism. the priest and the servers would stand at the lead server would stand at the base of the altar, and there they would say a prayer to each other, as I say. Quite an interesting exercise to watch, actually, because it was all full of drama. But beyond the drama, it was most solemn. It went something like this. They would speak to each other. The first thing the priest said after blessing himself was, in Latin, I will go into the altar of God. I will go into. Literally, I will go to your table. And the server would say, in Latin again, Ad Deum qui lectat juventum meam, to God who giveth joy to my youth. He answers him. And then the Judicia me, which is the judge me, Psalm 42, which they would say to each other. And then they would have the public confession, the confiteor, basically. He's still standing at the foot of the altar, by the way. He's gone through all the ritual purifications. One more purification before he goes up to the altar, which is the confession, the public confession. Remember, we may have dispensed with the public confession of our personal sins, but we haven't done away with the public confession. We still stand there, and we still beat our chests and say, even despite the fact that I've gone through the inner purification and the outer purification, I'm still a sinful person, and I always will be. I'll always fall. And I'm ready to admit that to you people. Again, that's what makes us different these days, very different these days. But then, after the confiteor, the priest goes up to the altar, slowly ascends the 3 steps and arrives at the altar. And this is what he says. Take away from us our iniquities, we beseech thee, O Lord, that we may be worthy to enter with pure minds into the Holy of Holies, through Christ our Lord. With pure minds into the Holy of Holies. Now, remember that this was not a new expression. This was an expression that's been there since the Old Testament. Again, from Mount Sinai, when we had the first tabernacle, the first home, the first house for God that was born along the route to the Promised Land, often in treacherous conditions. So this is the ascension to the Holy of Holies. And I think it's a remarkable thing to be reminded that the priest felt bound not to march up the 3 steps and begin the process as the mediator between us and the host. He stopped, paused, hesitated, and said, "I am not worthy. No matter what happens now in the next hour, I am not worthy." This is the end of our journey, really, though, because once we reach the table of the host, we have the meal and then we depart. We have gone through all our various stages of reconciliation and our communing at a very superficial level. We've discussed and we've said our prayers, we've knelt and the candles have been lit, and so on and so forth. All the usual trappings of a meal and of communion, of atonement, of belonging together at one minute. Now we're totally at one at this point in the process. Once the priest ascends the altar, or comes onto the altar. Now, the interesting thing about the new altar here is that it's not so new. In fact, it's older than that altar up there, because all the original altars were wood. From the time of Christ, the original altars were wooden altars. I mean, after all, the table upon which Christ celebrated the first Mass was wood. The tables were all wooden at that stage, especially in circumstances of that social class. And the original altars that they celebrated the Eucharist on, which of course was just a meal in the early days, there was no ritual surrounding it really, were wooden altars. Stone emerged after a number of centuries. It's all right, we're nearly there, Rosemary. Stone emerged only after a number of centuries, and that again was just to give a sense of permanence to the whole rite and the whole ritual. But wooden altar, a wooden table for the Eucharistic meal was very much the norm. I must say, though, unlike our normal tables where we have our meals, this is not only a table, of course. This is a little Calvary, and it's also an empty tomb. The emphasis after Vatican II is away from the tent, away from the Old Testament notion of tabernacle, to the table, where the offering, the sacrifice, is performed. You know, every day the heavens open at this point in the consecration of the Mass, and God literally empties himself. The Father literally empties himself through the Son again. And it's a nice way of looking at it, that there's an emptying, bleeding, a dying to himself again. He literally dies to himself every time the Eucharist is celebrated. Dying to himself. The way any host does, of course, as I was explaining earlier. They die, we die to ourselves, we give up the ghost, as it were. Empties, pours himself out, pours himself into the species of bread and wine. Remember, again, more tangible stuff, real food, not eating on the hoof. The symbols of unity. When remember when Jesus is talking about prayer in St. Luke's Gospel, and he says, and he's talking about, he wants to give bread to the person who comes in the early hours and they're banging on the door. He wants to give them bread, it's bread. Bread is the food of sustenance, the real sign that you belong. We say we break bread together around the table. And that's exactly what happens here. The bread is the symbolic food of belonging, of coming together, of union. And of course, in emptying himself, in dying to himself again and again and again and again and again, he takes the form of the Son. The Son, of course, who said, I am this. I am this. He didn't just say, do this in memory of me. He said, I am this. This is me. And when you consume this, you become me, and I become you. Identity amid difference. So that little table is, again, a reminder of what the Franciscans still protect to this day, and not only a reminder, it's an actual replica, an actual literal replica. It's not even a sign, it's not a symbol. This is the one place in the church where we do away with symbols. This is the actual thing, as it were. It's as if you took Calvary and the empty tomb and just put them there. It's as if you took the table from the upper room and you put it there. The same thing, at least from the Catholic, in our faith, this is what happens. The same thing is reenacted over and over and over again, which is why the table of the Lord is not only a table, it's the 3-in-1. It's the table from the upper room. It's the mount upon which he died. It's the empty tomb. We can see what happens, of course, whereas you couldn't when the Mass was celebrated in front of the tabernacle. But the breaking of the fraction, this is what really annoys me about those who take those priests who take the words of consecration literally, when he took the bread and broke it and they break the bread. Now they're treating it as bread. The bread is broken at a certain point in the Mass because Christ was broken at a certain point. Christ, his body was broken. He's literally broken to pieces. And then what happens? Just after the host is broken, the host breaks himself for you. Just after the host is broken, a little fraction. You hardly notice it because the Agnus Dei or the Lamb of God is set at that point. The little fraction is taken off. What happens? The fraction is let go into the wine, which is now the blood. The two become one, they're reunited. Christ is restored. So the Calvary precedes the resurrection. You break the bread at the moment of consecration, you're breaking bread. And the symbolism of Christ's brokenness, his death, his immolation, his Holocaust, is lost on us at the end. I will say something about just by closing, about the tabernacle, because it is, no matter what happens, it is still the focal point and should always be the focal point. Because, while the sacrifice is daily, the sacrifice is undertaken daily here at the altar, the living presence of Christ is constantly there, which is why, of course, we have the two burning flames on either side. Again, a reminder of something constantly burning, as it was down below. The Hebrew word for tabernacle is mishkan, or dwelling place, residence. Again, it's all about home and that experience of home, of homecoming. And to bind it to what I was saying earlier, the Exodus carried it, the Holy of Holies, what they call the locus of God's presence. They felt that if they carried this thing with them, God would remain with them for the journey, despite all their trials and tribulations, and eventually they did reach the promised land. And tabernacle in English comes from the Latin tabernaculum, or means tent or hut, again referring back to the old sense of the old Hebrew sense of a home for God. Again, going back to Mount Sinai and the direction to Moses. It should be immovable, according to church law now, and according to in fact, the decrees of Vatican II. It should, they say, about those decrees, be immovable, be made of solid and immovable material. Just one last reminder that the host is always here, now. Today, tomorrow, and yesterday. The Alpha and the Omega. So there's no doubt in your mind that whenever you come to this place, it's not like coming to somebody's house and finding that they didn't remember the date and they're not there. The host is always there, always welcoming, always giving, and of course is a symbol of what a real host should be. The Orthodox Jews, in a beautiful way, still set a place for Elijah at their kitchen table and at their dining table, in the hope that he may come. And it's just perchance that he may show up. And of course, it's a beautiful symbol that, sojourners or wanderers or voyagers or whatever you want to call them do show up unexpectedly. And of course, it's one of the great commandments of the gospel: be awake, be ready for all eventualities. But be awake especially for my coming, but for everybody's coming. But the beautiful thing about coming here is that there's no expectation that somebody will come. The host is here already. And that is a constant reminder of the two flames burning on either side, except of course from the night of Holy Thursday to the vigil on Easter Saturday, when the tent is empty. It's I've seen people, not least myself, at the moment on Holy Thursday when the ciborium is taken from the tabernacle, and the tabernacle is left starkly empty, cry, actually. And why does that happen? Because the thing that the experience of home that we so often neglect when we come to this place suddenly hits you. The things that you take for granted. That now he's no longer there. You never think of that as you come daily or as you come weekly. But suddenly it hits you that it's not there. The host is no longer there to be your welcoming, to give you your welcome, to feed you. It's a horrible thing, actually. And the words of Pange Lingua, as they ring around every church on that night, again are a stark reminder of the fact that suddenly the home is empty, but not for too long.